My name is Carly. I'm 27 years old, and I'm an independent artist living in Boston. I work long hours in a tiny studio apartment, scraping by on commissions and the occasional gallery sale. It's not glamorous. It's not easy. But it's mine. Every line I draw, every painting I sell, it's all a step forward in a life I chose, even if that life constantly feels like walking a tightrope above disaster. I had just wrapped up a series of late nights completing a difficult mural project when it happened. My hands were stained with oil paint, my mind buzzing with fatigue and caffeine, when my phone lit up with a message notification. At first, I ignored it, probably another alert from the bank or a reminder from my scheduling app. But then I saw who it was from. My mother. The last time we'd spoken, it hadn't gone well. That wasn't unusual. Most of our conversations since I moved out ended in tension or disappointment. But still, I tapped the screen, half hoping it might be something different, something warm. What I saw instead sent a chill through me so sharp I nearly dropped the phone. We changed all the locks. You don't have a home anymore. Let's see how brave you are now. Haha. It was the kind of message that burns itself into your brain. I read it once, twice, a third time, hoping each time that maybe I'd misread it, that maybe it meant something else. But the meaning was clear. It wasn't a threat. It was a declaration, a severing. I stood frozen in the middle of my studio, the noise of the city outside completely swallowed by the ringing silence in my head. Something inside me cracked open. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe for a moment. My vision blurred. I had just given them everything I had left. The roof of their house had collapsed during a heavy rainstorm, and without hesitation, I'd emptied my savings, money I'd set aside for a possible down payment on my own place, to pay for its replacement. $18,000. Gone in a single wire transfer. No questions asked, because I thought that maybe finally it would prove I wasn't the selfish disappointment they believed me to be, that I was part of the family, that I mattered. Apparently, I was wrong. For 2 days, I didn't sleep. I wandered from the studio to a friend's couch and back, my mind spiraling with shame and confusion. What had I done to deserve this? What kind of mother does that to her child? I replayed every conversation we'd had in the past year, trying to find the moment when the distance between us had become irreparable. But the truth was, it had always been there. I just hadn't wanted to see it. Before I go any further, I want to ask something of you. If you've made it this far, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever felt like you were punished for simply existing, for living your truth instead of someone else's version of your life, please subscribe. I tell these stories because I know I'm not alone, because I know someone else out there needs to hear this right now. I wasn't always the black sheep. When I was younger, before the shift, I was a daddy's girl. My father, James, was the first person who ever told me I had talent. He was an artist too, a quiet, meticulous man with kind eyes and stained fingers from charcoal and oil pastels. Our little house used to smell like turpentine and lavender. He let me draw on the walls when I was 5. Said a creative spirit should never be confined. He made me feel seen. But cancer has a way of erasing the things you love. He was gone before I turned 16. And when he left, something inside my mother fractured. Her name is Susan. She was a school teacher, stern but fair, organized, grounded. After Dad died, she became untethered. Her laughter disappeared. Her warmth dimmed. She held it together for a while, but eventually, grief hollowed her out. And then came Robert. He showed up at a school fundraiser, tall, polished, confident. He said all the right things, gave her flowers, listened to her stories, and soon she was smiling again. I wanted to be happy for her, truly. But from the moment he walked into our lives, I felt like a guest in my own home. His tone with me was patronizing. His opinions about my art were dismissive, and slowly everything in our world began to orbit around him. When Lily was born, his daughter, my half-sister, everything changed again. She became the favorite, the golden child, the one who made Susan's new family feel whole. I was just a reminder of the past, of the man she lost. It didn't matter how hard I worked, how kind I tried to be. My passion for art was labeled a distraction. My independence was a threat, and every choice I made that didn't align with Robert's vision was treated like betrayal. So I left. I packed my things, turned down their offer to help me find a real job, and moved into a crumbling apartment near the Boston Art District. I started over from scratch. The last time the old house ever felt like home was the day before Robert moved in. I remember the light that came through the kitchen window, soft and golden, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been painted in watercolor. My mom had made pancakes, something she rarely did after my dad died. For a few fleeting hours, it felt like maybe we were healing. Maybe we were going to be okay. I didn't know then that it would be the final moment of calm before the shift, the last echo of the life we used to have. Robert came with clean shoes, a polished smile, and answers to problems we hadn't yet voiced. He was the kind of man who made you feel like things were under control, even when they weren't. My mother needed that. After Dad died, her grief became a silent companion. It wrapped itself around her like a fog, dulling her edges. I think Robert's certainty gave her something to hold on to. And she clung. At first, I tried to like him. I wanted to. He spoke with the practiced calm of someone used to being listened to. He didn't yell, didn't make crude jokes, didn't act like the stepfather cliches in the movies. No, his cruelty was colder than that. Smarter. It wore the costume of concern. He would glance at my sketchbooks with a raised eyebrow, ask me what I planned to do with my talent. He offered advice cloaked as compliments, observations wrapped in subtle judgment. My mother began to repeat his words back to me days later, like she had rehearsed them without realizing. It was the beginning of a slow, strategic erosion. Within a year, everything in our lives had changed. We left the little house, Dad's house, and moved into Robert's mansion in the suburbs. It was sterile and echoing, with white walls and wide staircases, nothing like the cluttered warmth we had known. The halls felt too long, the ceilings too high. Even our footsteps sounded different there. My father's paintings didn't come with us. Most of our old furniture didn't either. It was as if we'd been wiped clean, repackaged, and inserted into someone else's idea of success. My mother quit her job shortly after the move. Robert insisted she didn't need to work anymore. He told her she deserved rest, and she believed him. I watched as her independence faded, slowly, then all at once. She stopped wearing the colorful scarves she loved. Her laugh became something quieter, more polite. She stopped calling her friends. He made sure she had everything, except a life of her own. When Lily was born, it sealed the transformation. She was the symbol of their new beginning, the crown jewel of their perfectly curated life. My mother poured everything into her, every scrap of love, time, and energy that had once been mine now belonged to Lily. I wasn't angry at the baby. She was innocent, but I couldn't help feeling like I'd been replaced. There was no space for me in that house anymore, not emotionally, not creatively. Robert turned what had once been my art corner into a guest room. My supplies were boxed up and moved into the garage. The studio Dad had helped me build, just a folding table by a window, was dismantled without discussion. Every reminder of him, of us, was quietly erased. I started drawing late at night under my covers, sketching by flashlight because I was too afraid of the questions that would come if anyone saw. They didn't understand art, but more than that, they didn't value it. Robert believed in numbers, in plans, in control. Art was chaos. It was emotion. It was memory. He couldn't contain it, and so he dismissed it. And slowly, my mother began to echo his opinions like gospel. I stopped bringing my drawings to the dinner table. I stopped talking about school projects. Every time I tried, it led to a new lecture about being practical, about choosing a real career, about not throwing away my future on pipe dreams. They had already decided who I was supposed to be. I just didn't fit the mold. By the time I turned 18, I had learned to disappear within my own home. I kept my head down. I made excuses. I became good at being invisible. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, they might leave me alone. But Robert didn't want compliance. He wanted transformation. When I applied to art school, they lost it. Not in the explosive way you'd expect, no shouting or tears, just disappointment that felt like a verdict. Their disapproval hung in the air for weeks like a storm cloud that never broke. My mother barely looked at me. Robert began questioning my every decision, from what I wore to who I spoke to. It was suffocating. But I went anyway. I worked part-time to cover what scholarships didn't. I rented a tiny room near campus, ate ramen noodles, sold sketches to classmates for $20 apiece. I made it work. And through it all, I kept telling myself that one day they'd come around. That one day they'd be proud of me again. That day never came. Instead, when I visited on breaks, I felt like an intruder. The walls of the house had absorbed my absence. My childhood bedroom had become a storage room. Lily, now old enough to mimic Robert's dismissiveness, barely acknowledged me. My mother smiled tightly, asked superficial questions, and avoided anything real. The final blow came when I turned 25 and remembered the trust fund. It had been something my father quietly set up when I was small, a way to help me through school and eventually give me a foundation. He wanted me to have choices, freedom. But when I asked about it, my mother hesitated. She told me Robert had reinvested it for me, that we could discuss it later. Later never came. By then, I had already learned how to survive without their support. I built my life brick by brick, gallery submissions, side jobs, freelance work. It was messy. It was unstable, but it was real. What I didn't realize was that I hadn't seen the worst of it yet, that the biggest betrayal was still ahead, and it would come in the form of a break-in, a missing inheritance, and a message that confirmed what I had tried for so long not to believe, that I was no longer part of the family I was born into. I was just a problem to be removed. The moment I asked about the trust fund, I knew something was wrong. It had been buried in the back of my mind for years, a vague memory attached to my father's voice and a fireproof lockbox he used to keep in the hall closet. He'd mentioned it once when I was 13, just after his second chemo session. He was pale, thinner than usual, and his hands shook slightly as he rested them on my shoulders. He told me he had made sure I'd be okay even if he wasn't around. I didn't fully understand what he meant then, but I remembered the warmth in his voice, the seriousness in his eyes. The trust was supposed to mature when I turned 25. 2 years had already passed. I hadn't thought about it much before. I had been too busy surviving. But on a random evening, while reviewing my finances and weighing whether I could afford a slightly bigger studio apartment, it resurfaced. That's when the slow dread began to crawl through me. The next morning, I called my mother. I tried to sound neutral, casual, like I was simply asking a financial question. Her response was light, too quick, like someone brushing crumbs off the edge of a table. She said Robert had taken care of it, that it had been reallocated years ago. She called it complicated, wrapped it in vague terms, and promised we'd talk about it at the next holiday. That conversation left a hole in my chest. I knew, deep down, that the money was gone, but I still clung to the idea that maybe it had just been poorly managed, that maybe Robert had moved it into a different account, that maybe my mother simply didn't understand. So I went home for Thanksgiving. The house looked the same from the outside, immaculate, soulless. Inside, the table was set like a catalog display with gold-trimmed plates and too many forks. My seat was at the far end now, a subtle shift in hierarchy that no one acknowledged. Robert dominated the conversation with his stories about new business ventures and emerging markets. Lily's achievements, elementary school contests and piano recitals, were applauded like royal announcements. I smiled when appropriate, laughed when expected. I waited for dessert. When I brought it up, the entire room seemed to tilt slightly. Robert's tone turned clipped. My mother's smile faltered. They said the money had been used for the family, for Lily's education, for an investment opportunity that hadn't quite worked out. They spoke like it was ancient history, like it was theirs to give away. It wasn't just money. It was a promise, a piece of my father's legacy, proof that even as he faded, he had been thinking of me. And now it was gone, swept into the same void where the rest of my childhood had vanished. That night, I returned to Boston in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat in the train, staring out the window, the reflection of my own face barely recognizable. It was the look of someone realizing they'd been erased in slow motion, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. Over the following weeks, I tried to focus on work. I poured everything into painting, into trying to convert emotion into something tangible. I created a series of abstract pieces, dark swirls, violent brushstrokes, bursts of red against endless gray. My mentor, David, noticed the shift immediately. He asked if everything was okay. I said I was just trying something new. I didn't know how to tell him that I was unraveling. I began researching the legal aspects of the trust. I looked up public records, contacted the bank that had once managed it, and found nothing. It was as if it had never existed. Every document, every transaction had been filtered through Robert's business entity. And since my mother had been the legal guardian when I was a minor, she had the authority to sign everything. There were no protections left, no paper trail strong enough to fight with. And yet, I still felt this compulsion to keep digging, to not let it go. Not because I expected to recover the money, but because I needed the truth. I needed to see clearly what had been taken from me, even if there was no way to get it back. That's when the break-in happened. I came home to find the door locked but the latch misaligned. My stomach turned before I even stepped inside. Everything looked oddly untouched. No broken glass, no overturned furniture. But the moment I reached my desk, I saw it. My external hard drives were gone. My sketchbooks. The folder I'd been keeping with notes about the trust and copies of old emails from Walter Grayson, one of my dad's former business partners. All of it. Gone. The police said there were no signs of forced entry, that it might have been someone with a key. They took a report and left. I stood in the middle of my apartment, feeling like the walls had closed in. I knew who had done it, or at least who had ordered it. I didn't even need proof. It was the same cold efficiency Robert applied to everything. Tie up loose ends, keep control, eliminate risk. I was just another variable he didn't like, a problem to solve. I called my mother the next day. I told her everything, the break-in, the missing evidence, my suspicion. Her voice was calm, too calm. She said maybe it was time I let go, that maybe I was imagining things, that perhaps this was all just part of being an adult, accepting that life isn't fair. I hung up the phone and sat there in silence. The betrayal wasn't a single act. It was the culmination of years of silence, complicity, and denial. My mother hadn't just looked the other way. She had chosen it, over and over. From that moment on, I stopped pretending. I didn't go home for Christmas. I didn't answer texts. I didn't send updates. I stopped trying to explain my life, my art, or my choices. The girl who had once painted to be seen was gone. In her place was someone colder, quieter, but harder, sharper. But just when I thought it couldn't get worse, just when I believed the worst had already happened, the message arrived that would confirm everything. The message that would tell me, in no uncertain terms, that my mother had finally made her choice, and that I no longer had a home. The truth didn't come as an explosion. It came like a whisper, quiet, precise, undeniable. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special about it. I was at a small cafe near my studio, sketching concepts for a commission I wasn't sure I had the energy to complete. My mind had been foggy for days, full of restless thoughts and emotions I couldn't fully name. I was tired. Not just physically, but in the kind of way that seeps into your bones and steals your focus. That kind of tired. That's when the past walked through the door in the form of a man with salt and pepper hair and a familiar expression, soft but edged with something heavier. I recognized him instantly, though I hadn't seen him in over a decade. Walter Grayson, one of my father's closest colleagues. He used to come to the house when I was little, always carrying folders, always laughing loudly in our kitchen while Dad poured coffee for them both. He was part of the old life, the one I thought had died with my father. I didn't expect what he told me next. He started with a name, Winston Designs, my father's company. It was never large, never flashy, but it was built with integrity, with passion. Walter told me that after Dad's diagnosis, Robert had inserted himself into the company's operations, first as a helping hand, then as a decision maker. He had offered financial advice, restructured departments, and presented my father with paperwork during what should have been palliative moments. I listened in silence, heart pounding. Walter said he'd tried to warn my mother, tried to slow things down, but by then, Robert had already gained too much ground. And the truth was, my father had trusted him. He was dying and desperate to make sure we'd be okay. That trust was his final mistake. By the time Dad passed, Robert owned the majority share of the company. He didn't even wait 6 months before gutting it. He merged it with one of his own businesses, laid off staff, sold off assets, and erased the Winston name from every public record he could find. What remained was unrecognizable, a shell of what once was, stripped clean for profit. I sat there numb, barely hearing the last few things Walter said. My father's legacy wasn't just lost, it had been stolen. Quietly, legally, and irreversibly. After that conversation, I couldn't sleep. I spent the next several nights digging through old documents I had tucked away in storage boxes, emails, invoices, faded business cards. I reached out to a few of my dad's former employees, people who had worked with him before everything fell apart. Most of them didn't respond. A few did, but their messages were cautious, vague. Some feared legal repercussions. Others admitted they still felt afraid of Robert's reach. What I found confirmed everything Walter had said, and more. There were email chains between Robert and my father showing how he had subtly begun to take over operations, first as a temporary solution, then as the de facto CEO. I found accounting reports that had been edited multiple times, with versions dated only days apart, suggesting manipulation of the company's financial outlook. There were meeting records with names of business associates my father had never liked, now conveniently listed as strategic partners. But the most damning piece was a scanned draft of my father's original will. It outlined a clear plan. The company would be held in trust for me until I turned 25, with my mother receiving income from the profits. That draft had never been finalized. Instead, another version, signed weeks before his death, left everything in my mother's name with no mention of a trust, no mention of me. It made me physically sick. To imagine my father lying in a hospital bed, disoriented and in pain, signing away the last thing he had built, guided by the voice of a man who smiled too easily and told him everything would be okay. A man who, even then, was already planning how to dismantle the pieces. The betrayal was staggering, and it wasn't just Robert. My mother had to have known something. Maybe not every detail, maybe not how deep it went, but enough. Enough to ask questions. Enough to pause before signing papers that erased her daughter from a future that was meant to be protected. But she didn't pause. She allowed it. The grief that followed wasn't just for my father. It was for the life I thought he had secured for me. For the belief that someone had been looking out for my future when I was too young to understand how fragile that security really was. And now, as an adult, I saw it clearly. He had tried. He had planned. He had done everything right. And it still wasn't enough to protect me from the people closest to us. I started collecting everything. Printing documents, organizing dates, highlighting names. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about clarity. About seeing the full picture, no matter how painful it was. The more I uncovered, the more I felt the old version of myself falling away. The version that made excuses for my mother. The version that clung to hope. The version that still thought love alone could fix anything. By the end of the week, I had a binder thick with evidence and a heart full of questions that might never be answered. I didn't know what I planned to do with the information. Confront them? Sue them? Expose Robert? I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I couldn't carry the truth in silence anymore. So I made a decision. I packed everything into my car and drove to the mansion. Not as a daughter seeking comfort, but as a witness demanding answers. I walked through that front door armed with the truth, and I had no idea what it would cost me. The night I confronted them, I didn't go to destroy anything. I went for truth, for acknowledgement, for one moment of clarity from the people who had built their lives around pretending I didn't exist. The drive to the mansion was long and quiet. I didn't play music. I didn't rehearse what I was going to say. I just kept both hands on the wheel and tried to breathe through the storm that was building behind my ribs. The evidence was in the trunk. Binders, documents, copies of emails, and old financial files. The truth was with me. I wasn't sure they'd listen, but I needed to say it out loud. The house looked exactly the same. Perfect. Unchanged. It was always too quiet there, the kind of silence that covered up the mess. When I rang the bell, I waited a long time before the door opened. I could tell by the flicker of surprise that my visit was unexpected. I walked in anyway. I wasn't asking for permission. We sat in the living room. Robert in his usual posture of superiority. My mother somewhere between discomfort and detachment. The house smelled like citrus cleaner and something expensive I couldn't name. Everything was in its place, as if chaos could never touch them here. But I brought it in with me. I laid the papers out on the glass coffee table one by one, explained what I'd discovered, described what I had been told. I watched their faces carefully. Robert stayed still at first, calm and unreadable, but when I mentioned the altered will, his jaw tensed. When I showed the email chains, something in his eyes shifted, more irritation than fear, like someone watching a mosquito buzz closer than expected. My mother barely spoke. She looked at the documents as if they were foreign, as if seeing them made her a bystander in her own life. I kept waiting for her to speak, to react, to reach for me. But she stayed exactly where she was, like she had chosen her seat and decided never to leave it. Eventually, the silence turned sharp. Robert stood, his expression hardened. I knew then there would be no apology, no reckoning. He would never admit what he had done. Men like him didn't explain. They erased. When I turned to my mother for something, anything, her eyes dropped. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Finality. It was like watching the door close for good. I left that house different than I entered. I wasn't angry when I walked out. I was hollow. It was a strange kind of grief, worse than death because they were still alive, still living their lives, just without me. It was the realization that I was no longer just unwelcome. I was irrelevant. I drove straight back to Boston without stopping, parked my car outside my building, and sat there for nearly an hour, gripping the steering wheel like it might keep me tethered to something. I couldn't go inside. Not yet. When I finally walked into my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. I just stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the pieces of my life, half-finished canvases, scattered paint tubes, coffee-stained sketch pads. I was still trying to rebuild what they had taken from me, still trying to create something beautiful from a lineage that had been ripped apart. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I kept thinking about the look on my mother's face, blank, polite, almost relieved, as if my accusations had confirmed something for her, as if her silence was all she had left. I tried to distract myself the next morning, cleaned the kitchen, sorted through reference photos, sent emails to clients, but it was mechanical, robotic. My mind kept drifting back to what I'd left behind in that house. Not the documents or the questions, but a version of myself that still wanted their approval. She was gone now. Later that evening, I went out for groceries. When I came back, something felt wrong before I even opened the door. There was no visible damage, no sign of forced entry. But the air was different, too still. The kind of silence that signals something has been disturbed. My desk had been emptied. My external drives were missing. My sketchbooks, the ones with preliminary work for my next exhibit, were gone. The folder where I'd stored backup documents? Gone. Only the physical paintings were untouched. Everything else that mattered had vanished. The police were sympathetic but unhelpful. No signs of forced entry meant no clear suspect. They asked if I had any idea who might want to harm me. I didn't answer. Not really. I just nodded through the paperwork, accepted the case number, and closed the door behind them with shaking hands. It was like déjà vu, another theft, another erasure. Except this time, it was personal. Someone had wanted to silence me, not just scare me, but take away the proof, take away the progress, make it harder for me to stand on what I knew. And once again, the silence from my mother was deafening. I called her, one last time, told her what had happened, told her I was scared, that I had nothing left to prove what I knew. Her response was clinical, dismissive. She said maybe I needed to stop digging, that I was only hurting myself by holding on to things that couldn't be changed. That was the moment I truly broke, not because of the loss, not because of the files or the stolen sketchbooks or the hours I'd spent building my case, but because in the face of everything, evidence, theft, fear, my mother still stood on the wrong side of the line, not as someone unsure or confused, but as someone who had already made peace with betrayal. I didn't cry that night. I didn't scream or break anything. I sat on the floor of my apartment, staring at the empty space where my files used to be. And for the first time, I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. They had taken everything: my trust, my inheritance, my father's company, my safety, my work, and now, even my voice. At least they thought so. But there was one thing they hadn't taken: my memory. I still remembered what my father taught me. I still remembered what truth felt like. And if they thought they could bury me with stolen files and forced silence, they had underestimated the one thing that had carried me this far. I still knew who I was, and I wasn't done fighting. 2 days after the break-in, I stopped recognizing myself in the mirror. I was moving through life like a shadow, quiet, empty, stretched thin by fear and exhaustion. My eyes were swollen from lack of sleep, and the dark circles underneath made me look older than I felt. I kept replaying the moment I saw my empty desk, the absence of my hard drives, the missing sketchbooks. I thought of my father, of everything he had left behind, and wondered what he'd say if he saw me now. If he'd be proud I kept fighting, or heartbroken by how much I had to lose first. David and Olivia had offered me shelter without hesitation. Their apartment was small but warm, filled with signs of a life that felt steady. Framed photos, soft lighting, the faint smell of brewed coffee and linseed oil. They gave me their guest room, no questions asked. I didn't have the words to thank them properly, so I didn't try. I just showed up with a duffel bag and a hollow expression, and they welcomed me without needing the full story. I hadn't told anyone yet, but I knew who had done it. Maybe not with his own hands, but Robert's fingerprints were all over the break-in. It was too precise, too specific. Whoever entered my apartment didn't take anything of monetary value, just what mattered, just what could expose him. That kind of theft wasn't random, it was targeted. Still, there was no proof, no cameras, no witnesses, and no one willing to believe me except David. I tried to stay busy at the studio. I kept my head down, worked long hours, and avoided social media altogether. I didn't want to see any photos from the mansion, no curated snapshots of smiling faces pretending everything was perfect. I couldn't stomach the idea that they were moving forward while I was being buried alive by the weight of what they'd done. Then the email came. It arrived just after midnight. The subject line was simple, but ominous. Urgent. Call me immediately. We have a problem. The sender was Harold Brown, my family's former lawyer, the man who had once overseen my father's estate. I hadn't heard from him in years, not since I was a teenager and the paperwork around Dad's will had been finalized. I opened the message with trembling hands. The tone was professional, but the urgency was unmistakable. He asked me to call as soon as possible, said it concerned Robert, said it wasn't safe to explain everything over email. I stared at the screen for a long time, torn between skepticism and curiosity. Part of me thought it was a trap, another manipulation, another setup. But something about it felt different, clean, unaligned with the people who had hurt me. Still, I didn't want to use my own phone. I didn't trust it anymore. David let me borrow his. When Harold answered, his voice sounded strained, as though he hadn't slept much either. He got straight to the point. Robert had been arrested. Charges included financial fraud, money laundering, and several other allegations still under investigation. The FBI had raided the house, confiscated computers, documents, even personal files. I stood there in the guest room, the phone pressed to my ear as the world tilted beneath my feet. Robert, arrested. For months, I had been screaming into a void, trying to convince anyone who would listen that something was wrong, that he wasn't who he claimed to be, that my father's company had been stolen, that my trust fund had been buried under fake signatures and vague legal language. And now, finally, the world had caught up to the truth. Harold said some of the evidence that triggered the investigation had come from documents similar to what I'd been gathering. That someone I had spoken to, maybe Walter, maybe one of my father's former employees, had gone to the authorities. I thought back to my conversations, the quiet warnings, the reluctant admissions. Maybe someone had finally reached their breaking point. But then came the second part. My mother had asked Harold to contact me, not because she wanted to apologize, not because she had suddenly realized the gravity of what she'd allowed, but because she needed me. She was being questioned as a potential accomplice. Some of the documents bore her signature. Some accounts were in her name. The life she had built with Robert was unraveling, and she was at risk of being pulled under with him. I didn't know how to feel. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to ignore it. But the part of me that still craved answers, the part that hadn't fully given up on her, couldn't look away. Then Harold told me something that froze me completely. The text message. The one that said I didn't have a home anymore? The one that had pushed me over the edge? Had not been written by my mother. It had come from her phone, yes, but it was sent by Robert. She had only found out about it during questioning, when the FBI showed her her own message history. She had cried. She had broken down. She had asked Harold to find me, to tell me the truth. I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone still pressed to my ear, trying to hold myself together. The message that had shattered me had been a final act of sabotage. One last attempt to sever what little connection remained between us. Robert had known the walls were closing in, and in his final days of control, he tried to burn every bridge he couldn't walk across himself. I didn't cry. I didn't even breathe for a while. I just sat there, remembering the way my heart had dropped when I read those words. The humiliation, the despair, the way I had interpreted it as the last betrayal from the one person I was still hoping might save me. And now I knew she hadn't written it. But she had allowed everything that led up to it. Harold said she was staying with my aunt now, out of the mansion while the investigation unfolded. That she was scared, that she wanted to see me, that she had started to understand what Robert had done, not just to the family finances, but to her. To me, to my father. I agreed to meet her. Not because I forgave her, not because I believed she was innocent, but because I needed to see her face when she finally said the words I had waited a lifetime to hear. And because the part of me that still believed in my father's legacy, the part that refused to disappear, knew this wasn't over. The drive to my aunt's house was slow and deliberate. I didn't rush it. I took the long route, letting the road stretch beneath me like a question I wasn't ready to answer. The sun had already begun to set by the time I pulled into the familiar driveway. It had been years since I'd been there, since before Robert, before everything became so warped and impossible to untangle. This house had once held family dinners, laughter, the smell of roasted vegetables, and my aunt's cinnamon tea. It had once been a place where things felt simple. Now it felt like a place where something had been waiting for me. When I stepped inside, the air was quiet, still carrying the scent of books and old wood. My mother sat in the corner of the living room, hunched in a chair I barely remembered, a blanket draped over her lap like armor. She looked smaller, not just physically, but in spirit. Her shoulders were rounded, her posture collapsed. It was the first time I'd seen her without a mask. I didn't speak. I didn't move quickly toward her. I stood just inside the doorway, unsure if I belonged there, unsure if I wanted to. There was a long pause as she looked up, and I could tell she hadn't expected me to come. Her eyes were red, not from crying recently, but from days, maybe weeks, of quiet unraveling. The silence between us was heavy. Years of unsaid words settled into the space like dust. There was no apology waiting in the air, no grand gesture, just two women staring at each other across a canyon of pain. I finally sat across from her, not next to her. I wasn't ready for closeness. I wasn't ready for comfort. I wanted clarity. I wanted truth. And so I listened. Her voice was shaky but not performative. She didn't try to make excuses, and for that alone, I stayed. She began to describe what had happened in the days following Robert's arrest, how she had been questioned for hours, how she had discovered documents and accounts in her name that she had no memory of signing, how the agents had shown her text messages, financial records, lists of people Robert had manipulated, silenced, or erased. And then she told me what I already knew. She had allowed it, not all of it, not the worst of it, but enough. Enough to make her complicit, even in her silence. Enough to make her realize she had handed her life over to a man who only saw people as pieces on a board, movable, disposable, strategic. She admitted she hadn't written the text message. that it had broken her when she realized what Robert had done, using her phone to sever the last thread between us, that she had been too afraid to question him at the time, that for years she had convinced herself it was easier not to see. And that was the part that gutted me the most. She had chosen not to see. Not just the manipulation, not just the financial fraud, but me, my pain, my exile, the way I faded from birthdays, holidays, group photos, the way Lily became the center of her universe and I became a blurred edge in the background. She hadn't turned her back on me because she hated me. She had done it because it was easier than facing her own grief, her own complicity, her own shame. I didn't forgive her. Not in that moment. I wasn't ready for that. But I understood something I hadn't before. She had been consumed by him. Not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the woman who used to tuck me in and stroke my hair when I had nightmares. She had become someone else. And now, for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of the woman I used to know. The woman who had once loved me. She told me she was working with Harold now, trying to cooperate with the investigation, that she had surrendered every financial file, every account password, every scrap of evidence she could find, that she had started attending therapy, something she had resisted for decades, that she wanted, more than anything, to help make it right. I didn't promise anything. I didn't hug her. I didn't tell her it would all be okay. But I didn't walk away either. We sat there in silence for a while, two women trying to breathe in a space built from broken trust. And when I finally left, I didn't feel healed. I didn't feel whole. But I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Stillness. A pause in the storm. A moment to exhale. Back at David and Olivia's, I curled up on the couch with a blanket and let myself stare out the window. I thought about the mansion, the locked doors, the missing sketchbooks, the lies. I thought about the quiet apology my mother had offered without words. I thought about my father, how he would have hated all of this, how he would have fought like hell to stop it. I didn't know what came next, but I knew I had a choice now. I could bury what I knew, or I could use it. I pulled out the remaining documents I had, scans, notes, timelines, everything I had collected before the break-in. I began organizing them again, backups this time, multiple copies, secure cloud storage. I called Walter. I called Harold. I told them I was ready to speak to the investigators. I told them I was done being erased. That week, I gave my full statement to the authorities. Everything I knew about Robert, his manipulation, the company takeover, the trust fund, the forged will. Everything. I didn't hold back, and when they asked if I was willing to testify, I didn't hesitate. I said yes, not for revenge, not even for justice, but for my father, and for the version of myself that almost didn't survive this. Testifying isn't what people think it is. It's not dramatic or cathartic or even empowering, at least not at first. It's procedural, clinical. You sit in a sterile room across from people who ask you to relive the worst parts of your life while maintaining perfect clarity, perfect memory, perfect composure. There's no space for emotion, no room for trembling hands or wavering voices, just facts, just the evidence, just what they can use. Still, I went. I walked into that federal office building with my chin high and my documents in hand. I sat in front of two agents, a court reporter, and Harold, who was there more for emotional support than legal necessity. And I told them everything. From the day Robert entered our lives to the final message I thought came from my mother, from the theft of my trust fund to the erasure of my father's company, from the break-in at my apartment to the text that nearly broke me. I told them how he had isolated us, how he had manipulated signatures, coerced decisions, and ensured that the people around him stayed dependent and afraid. I described the way my mother's identity had faded under his control and how her silence had enabled so much destruction. I handed over copies of every document I had managed to recover: timelines, notes, email printouts, witness names. They didn't nod. They didn't react. They just recorded. I left the building shaking. It wasn't until I got back to David and Olivia's apartment that I broke. Not with tears, but with a sudden rush of exhaustion so deep it dropped me straight onto the couch. I didn't move for hours, just stared at the ceiling, replaying the past like a movie reel I couldn't shut off. But the next day, things began to change. Fast. Robert was denied bail. The charges against him multiplied: wire fraud, embezzlement, obstruction of justice, identity theft, and falsification of legal documents. It turned out I wasn't the only one. Other people came forward: former employees of Winston Designs, contractors he'd defrauded, one of my father's former partners, who had stayed silent for years out of fear, now submitted testimony and financial records that confirmed what we already knew. Robert had been building his empire on theft. The media picked it up. Articles began appearing online. Headlines naming him as a former financial advisor, accused of systematically dismantling small businesses for profit. One investigative piece even included quotes from anonymous victims who described being threatened, silenced, or bought off. They painted him not as a misunderstood businessman, but as a calculated predator who used charm and connections to destroy lives. I didn't speak to the press. I wasn't ready. But I watched. I watched the internet begin to dismantle the image he had worked so hard to build, and with it, the illusion my mother had clung to for so long. She called once. I didn't answer. Instead, I poured myself into my work. For the first time in months, I returned to my studio, not as someone hiding from the world, but as someone rebuilding inside it. I started painting again. Big, messy, emotional pieces. Nothing commercial, nothing easy. I painted the grief, the betrayal, the silence. I painted my father. And then I painted myself. Not as a victim, but as someone crawling out of the wreckage with bloodied hands and fire in her chest. I held a small gallery show a few weeks later. I didn't invite anyone from my past. Just friends, supporters, people who had held me up when I couldn't stand. David gave a short introduction. Olivia stood beside me as people walked through the room, quietly absorbing what I had created. No one said much, but their silence felt reverent, not empty. It was the first time in years I felt truly seen. Then came the subpoenas. I was listed as a key witness in the federal case. So was my mother. So were others. Court dates were set. Depositions scheduled. The government was building a case bigger than I could have imagined. And the more layers they uncovered, the more people Robert had hurt came forward. There were offshore accounts, shell companies, forged documents dating back nearly a decade. Some of the accounts had my mother's name on them, but she had already begun cooperating with investigators. According to Harold, that cooperation was likely what kept her from being charged. Still, the damage was done. She lost the mansion. It was seized as part of the investigation. Lily was pulled from private school. They moved in with my aunt. From what I heard, she rarely left the house. She'd become a ghost of herself, slowly unraveling as the lies she'd helped uphold collapsed around her. I didn't know how to feel about any of it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't take joy in her unraveling. But I didn't rescue her either. She had chosen Robert, over and over. And now, finally, she was standing in the debris of what that choice had cost. I was contacted by a few victims' rights groups. They asked if I would be willing to speak on behalf of those affected, not in court, but in closed sessions with other survivors of financial abuse. I said yes. And for the first time, I found myself in rooms full of people who understood. People who had also been erased, discredited, betrayed. People who had been told they were crazy for seeing what no one else would admit. We shared our stories quietly, with shaking voices, with tears. And in those sessions, I realized something I hadn't known before. I wasn't just surviving my story, I was reclaiming it. And in doing so, I was helping others reclaim theirs. I didn't know what justice would ultimately look like. Court cases drag on, appeals get filed, sentences can be lenient. But what mattered most was that Robert would never again have the power to control anyone's life like he controlled mine. He had been exposed, and that was a beginning. Healing wasn't a straight line. It wasn't a grand awakening or a morning I woke up suddenly feeling whole. It came in fragments, quiet, scattered, and often wrapped in pain. There were days when I still couldn't step into my old studio without hearing his voice in my head. Not Robert's voice, but the one I had internalized. The cold whisper that told me I didn't belong in my own life, that I was always one step away from being erased. That voice had lived with me longer than I realized. Even after Robert was arrested, even after the mansion was gone, even after the court case had started moving forward, that voice stayed behind. I had to learn to silence it myself. So I started from the beginning. I moved into a smaller studio apartment on the north side of Boston. It wasn't glamorous, bare walls, a leaky faucet, and a view of a brick wall. But it was mine, entirely mine. Every nail I hammered into the wall, every box I unpacked, felt like reclaiming something. I painted the space in shades of cream and moss green, colors that made me feel grounded. I bought a secondhand bookshelf and filled it with things that made me feel less alone. Art books, old journals, a photo of my father I had kept tucked in a drawer for years. I created new routines. I woke early, made coffee in silence, read poems before checking my phone. I began painting again, not for galleries or deadlines, but for me. I painted grief. I painted longing. I painted the kind of silence that follows betrayal. Slowly, my brush strokes grew bolder. I started using gold leaf, metallics, even charcoal. My work shifted, evolved. It stopped trying to please. It began to speak, and people noticed. A small local gallery invited me to do a solo exhibit, not because of the story behind my name or the court case, but because someone had seen my paintings at the community center and said they felt like breathing underwater. I accepted without hesitation. This time, I didn't hide my truth in metaphors. I titled each piece with fragments of my journey. One of the centerpieces was called Inheritance and featured layers of torn contracts and paint scraped over in deep crimson and cobalt. Another, Unspoken, was a canvas of raw linen stitched down the middle with black thread. The show was quiet, but powerful. People came. Some stood in front of the paintings for long minutes, not saying a word. A woman left a note under Unspoken that simply read, "You made me feel seen." That mattered more than any sale. Outside the art world, I began putting pieces of my personal life back together. I saw a therapist every Wednesday afternoon. I joined a support group for adult survivors of family financial abuse. We met in the basement of a church that smelled like old paper and wax, and for 1 hour each week we spoke freely about lost inheritances, toxic families, being disbelieved. No one minimized each other's pain. No one tried to solve anything. We just existed. And that somehow was healing. David and Olivia stayed close. Their friendship had become something sacred to me, a reminder that love didn't always have to come from blood. Some weekends, we cooked together. On others, we said nothing at all and simply existed in the same room, paint-stained and quiet, working on our own pieces of recovery. I didn't speak to my mother for a long time. I saw her face in newspapers sometimes, especially as the trial moved forward. She had been formally cleared of charges due to her cooperation, But the public didn't forgive easily. Her name had become tangled in the story, and I imagine it followed her wherever she went. Some days I felt pity, other days anger, but most days I felt distance. Then, one afternoon in early spring, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was a worn envelope, yellowed at the corners, and a small wooden box. The envelope held a letter written in my father's handwriting. It was dated 3 months before his death. He wrote about the trust fund, about his fears, about his hope that no matter what happened, I would find my way back to my art. He said he had chosen the name Winston Designs, not because of legacy or image, but because to design something is to build a future out of intention. The box held his old pocket watch, the same one he used to keep clipped to his vest during studio days. It didn't tick anymore, but I didn't need it to. It was a piece of him. It was time frozen, yet still full of meaning. I cried for the first time in weeks, not from pain, but from release. I didn't know if the package came from my mother. I had my suspicions, but no proof. Still, it softened something in me. Not enough to call her. Not yet. But enough to believe that maybe, somewhere in her, there was still a sliver of the woman who used to tuck me in and hum lullabies she'd forgotten the words to. With summer approaching, I began teaching art part-time at a local community center. Teenagers mostly. Kids who were too tired to pretend and too smart to be underestimated. I gave them blank canvases and no rules, just space. Some days they painted in silence. Other days they poured out everything: anger, confusion, love, fear. I didn't need to explain myself to them. They knew what it meant to be silenced. They knew what it meant to speak through color when words failed. I wasn't healed, not completely, but I was living, not just surviving the aftermath of betrayal, but creating something from it, something honest, something raw, something true. And in that process, I found myself again. Not the version they wanted me to be, not the girl who begged to be let back in, but the woman who walked away with empty hands, rebuilt her world, and discovered she had always been enough. There's a strange quiet that comes after survival. Not silence, exactly. More like the absence of noise you didn't know had been living inside you. Fear, shame, guilt, confusion, all of it buzzing under the surface for so long that when it finally fades, the quiet feels foreign. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. But over time, I started filling that space with something else. Myself. The first time I realized I was no longer afraid of my own life, I was sitting on the floor of my studio, barefoot, hands covered in ochre and blue. I had been working on a commission, a mural for a women's shelter, and the painting had taken over the walls. Swirling arms, blooming flowers, broken chains. Every stroke felt like breathing. And as I sat there, paint drying on my skin, I understood something. I had made it out. Not just out of the house or the past or the courtroom, out of their version of me, out of the narrative they tried to trap me in. I don't belong to them anymore. I don't belong to Robert's story or to the echo of my mother's silence. I don't belong to the money that was taken or the legacy that was rewritten. I belong to the girl who kept creating even when no one was looking. The woman who chose not to disappear, even when disappearing would have been easier. That's who I am now. I won't lie and say everything is perfect. There are still days I flinch at unexpected noises. Still nights I wake from dreams where I'm back in that house, where the walls close in and I'm 18 again, trying to be seen, trying not to be erased. But the difference now is, when I wake up, I know where I am. I know who I am, and I know who I'm not. I'm not their property. I'm not their pawn. I'm not the broken girl they tried to rebuild in Robert's image. I'm free. I started writing more after the trial. Not just journals, but essays, letters, fragments of thoughts I'd buried over the years. I didn't publish them. Not yet. But I saved them. Because stories like mine don't just belong in silence, they belong in the light. Maybe one day I'll publish them all. Maybe one day I'll stand in front of a room full of strangers and say, "This happened to me, and I'm still here." Maybe I'll write a book. Maybe I'll teach full time. Maybe I'll keep painting until there's no white wall left in the city untouched by color. Or maybe I'll just live. Maybe I'll wake up, make coffee, walk barefoot through my studio and feel the sun on my face. Maybe I'll smile at the version of myself in the mirror and say, "You made it." Maybe that's enough. For now, that is enough. I haven't spoken to my mother since the package. There's been no contact, no letters, no calls. And I think that's how it needs to be. For now. Forgiveness isn't something I can force. It's not a performance or a deadline. It's a process. And some things still sit too heavy in my chest. But I don't carry hatred anymore. I carry boundaries. And that is its own kind of peace. As for Robert, his trial continues. There's a long list of victims now. The court is full of testimonies, stacks of evidence, lives he's dismantled with the same quiet precision he used on ours. But the difference now is, people believe us. They see him for what he is. And no amount of money or manipulation can change that. He took so much from me. But he didn't take my truth. And in the end, that truth is what saved me. Not just from him, but from myself. From the version of me that was willing to shrink to fit inside their comfort. From the silence that nearly became a permanent home. From the lie that said I wasn't enough. Because I am. Not because I'm perfect, but because I survived. And because I chose to rebuild, not as they wanted me, but as I am. So if you've listened this far, if you've made it through my story, thank you. Thank you for sitting with the hard parts. Thank you for not looking away. And if this story resonated with you, even just a little, please like and subscribe to support this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Your voice matters. Your story matters. You are not alone. Amen.